Hi, I'm Peter Cooper, a Ruby developer and the author of an introductory Ruby book called Beginning Ruby, that's published by A Press. I also run Ruby Inside, the most popular Ruby news blog, Ruby Weekly, a weekly Ruby newsletter, co-host the Ruby Show podcast, and some other stuff too. My goal with this video is to give you a kind of a 35,000 feet view of Ruby, its community, its ecosystem, the language itself, basically so that you can more easily navigate any books, courses, or conferences that you're involved with. And I must point out that this isn't for experienced Rubyists at all. It's very entry level. I've avoided unnecessary detail. I'm not going to teach you, the entire Ruby language itself. That'd be a bit of a stretch for a 10-minute video. So I'm going to focus on the important stuff. We're only going to scrape the surface of the actual syntax and code, and instead we'll look at the bigger picture. I'm going to look at Ruby's downsides, its community, some of the libraries you can use, applications that have been made with Ruby, as well as the various implementations that can run Ruby source code. So this is Paul Graham. He's a famed essayist, venture capitalist, Lisp evangelist, developer. He runs Y Combinator, which is a startup incubator in the US, that's kind of, I guess, mostly famous now for running the Hacker News site, even though they've done a lot more than that. And this chap, in 2004, he wrote The Python Paradox, which was an essay where he stated, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, he said, you can get smarter programmers to work on a Python project than a Java one. And he said that's not because Java programmers are dumb, but because Python programmers are smart. Learning a language is a lot of work, and people don't learn Python to get a job. People learn Python because they genuinely like to program and are unsatisfied with the status quo. And if you're not aware, Python is another programming language which has a lot of similarities to Ruby, and what he says really applies to Ruby too, especially now many years on. He also said that a friend of his used Python for all of his projects because the code looks nice, which he says is frivolous, but a demonstration of someone who truly cares for programming. Like clay to a sculptor, true-blooded programmers want good clay, not lumpy clay. He also says languages like Python and Ruby are created and used by people who really care about programming, and those tend to be the ones who do it well. And this should say a lot about the ethos of the modern, dynamic, easy-to-use languages like Ruby and Python. So moving from one anecdote to another, before I'd sort of readily eat my vegetables as a child, my mother used to say, make me eat the worst part first, which is the vegetables, and then work my way to the nicest part. Although once I was older, she said to eat from the most expensive part to the cheapest. But I'm going to stick to the pre-vegetable scenario and dive into a couple of the most common complaints about Ruby, just so you can get the bigger picture. So here are some vegetables. Brussels sprouts, people eat these. Bizarrely, my baby daughter can't get enough of them. It's one of her top 3 foods. I'd hate them. But either way, I'm going to clear our plate of some of Ruby's vegetables now, and the first is Ruby being slow. In the Alioth shootout, which is a sort of a common benchmark between languages, Ruby 1.8 beats Python like once in the startup test. And that's just how long it takes the interpreter to start. That's not even actually running anything. And from there on, it's sort of 2 to 3 times slower. Against Perl, similar story. And then even against Java, some tests are hundreds of times slower on Ruby. Our Ruby 1.9 fares somewhat better than 1.8 on this, but it still doesn't really handily beat Perl or Python, so it's definitely one of the slower languages out there in terms of raw performance. But I don't think it's really that big a deal, because language is often used in things like web applications and the like, and in those situations, things like database speed, network latency, and just general kind of architectural issues get in the way. And you don't generally do sort of hardcore CPU heavy stuff in Ruby anyway, like video conversion or whatever. Ruby can just talk to other libraries or apps to do that heavy lifting where it's necessary. One thing that Ruby does do, though, is it emphasizes programmer speed rather than raw performance of the programs. So many people argue that it's cheaper to buy faster hardware than it is to get better programmers. Another problem with Ruby is that some people say it's unpopular. And it's a strong word. You could interpret it as niche, but if you're going on the number of events, books, people using the language, it is definitely a gulf between Ruby and say Java or C. And Paul Graham's essay demonstrates this isn't that important, but if you think it is, perhaps Ruby isn't the language for you. But how unpopular is it in the grand scheme of things? Well, this is a list of the languages in order of popularity in the TIOBE, TIOBE Programming Community Index, which isn't the world's most trusted benchmark for language popularity, I must admit, but it still gives you a general indicator. But you'll notice that some languages like Lisp aren't on there, or Erlang, or Haskell. So Ruby's perhaps not doing too bad, but as you can see, it's sort of way down there in about 10th or 11th place. Ruby's not that unpopular, but it's not ever going to be a Java or a C or a PHP. But then again, perhaps it shouldn't be. So let's look at the language a bit, and this is the guy who invented the language. It's Yukihiro Matsumoto. He's also known as Mats. If you see him, buy him a drink, shake his hands, or just otherwise be nice, because without him, we wouldn't be here listening to this video. He started work on Ruby in 1993. The first public release was in 95, and then Ruby 1.0 came out, I think it was Christmas Day 1996. So that makes it Ruby 1 branch 14 years old now. And he was guided by what he calls the principle of least surprise, which is where he wants Ruby developers to focus on the fun and the creativity of programming rather than syntax or language complexities. And if you ever go digging into the source code of, say, a Java project, you just know how bad things can get with how messy source code can be. And really, this is an advantage of Ruby. It's consistency and simplicity in about 95% of situations. Now, it's important to note that Ruby is not a domain-specific language. Ruby is not Rails. Rails is not Ruby. Rails is a single framework for developing web applications, amongst many, developed using the Ruby language. Ruby is not just a web development language, as you might say consider PHP to be. Ruby is a general-purpose programming language. It's cross-platform. You can make command line scripts with it. You can even do like one-liners from the command line to do file operations and so on. You can use it to make desktop applications, even Mac applications now with the Mac Ruby implementation, web apps, of course, even games that use 3D graphics. The only limitations you've got are obviously the speed that Ruby runs at and the libraries that are available to do the things you want to do. Some other key points is that it is very easy to extend Ruby. It's easy to plug into C libraries and so on. It's a fully object-oriented language. If you don't know what that means, unfortunately, this is not quite the place to go into it, but it is fully object-oriented, and it's a generally easy-to-use language due to its sort of consistency, and the fact that it's interpreted does help a little bit as well, and it makes it really well-suited for rapid development. So we're going to have a quick look at some of the syntax, and we're going to use a tool called IRB, which comes with Ruby. It stands for Interactive Ruby. It's basically an interactive prompt, a bit like a terminal or a command prompt, that processes Ruby code on the fly. So if I put in something like 2 plus 2, it will return 4. Obviously that's not too flashy an example, but it's a start. So rather than write our code in a source file that's saved to the disk, we can just type it into one of these IRB prompts. And this is a great way of learning the language or just demonstrating some simple concepts, as it saves having to use a text editor or IDE right off the bat. And there is actually a web version of IRB that you can play with right now at tryruby.org. Here's a picture of it and some basic things I just tried in it. But we're going to go back to you looking at a more local version of IRB now and try out what are called expressions. Simplest expression is something like a single element, like the number 2, for example. Or if we want to take, for example, a collection of letters like this, it's called a string. We also have these things that are called arrays. In Ruby, these are basically like lists. So here I've done a list of 4 different Danish cities. Here's another expression. This is where we bring 2 things together. So we've got 2 plus 2, we've got the 2 plus 3 times 8. Now we move on to variables. This is where we say that something equals something else. It's a placeholder. So we've got x equals 2, y equals 5, and then if we do the x plus y, we get the 2 plus 5. Of course, variables can also point to strings. Variables can point to anything because in Ruby, every single thing is an object. It's this kind of general quality that exists on all things of the language. So a number, a string, a list, all of these things are considered to be objects. And in the last example here, I've basically taken a string, added it to another string, which is just a space, added it to another string, and then we end up with another string as a result of that. So it's just taking objects and adding them together or putting them together in various different ways. So let's take these objects and go a bit further. So we've already said a string is an object. Well, we can call what are called methods on these objects. So in this case, I've called the length method on this is a test string, and it gives me 14. I can also convert it to uppercase, I can reverse that string, and I can also ask the string, what class of object is it? And a class basically defines what sort of thing an object is at a basic level. So I've asked X, which is a string, this is a test. What class are you? Tells me it's a string. And I can also chain together these different methods. So, for example, with x.uppercase.class, I've turned the string into its uppercase version and then asked it what class it is. It's still a string. In the next example, I've put it to uppercase and then reversed it. These latter examples are a little bit more advanced, but they basically involve doing substitutions over the content of the string. So I've changed all of the vowels into asterisks. In the latter example, I've turned them all into, well, basically non-width characters, so I've actually removed the vowels. One method that nearly all objects accept in Ruby is the methods method. And this returns a list, or an array as we call it, of all of the different methods that are defined or that object will accept. So the things like the length and the uppercase and so on for the string, they're in that list. And this is a great way to learn the language and look under the hood, as it were. You just call this methods method on anything, and you can find lots of stuff to play with and try out. And this is definitely one of the ways that I learned a lot when I was starting out with Ruby. So moving on, we have this other data type. We had the array/list. We've also have something called a hash. And a hash is basically like kind of like a dictionary to definition style lookup. So for example, in this case, we have a variable called Fred is pointing to a hash. And this hash contains basically 3 different elements that are separated with commas here. So we've got a name of Fred, we've got an age, which is 76, an occupation of janitor. And what's happening here is basically the term name is being linked to Fred, the term age is being linked to 76, and the term occupation is being linked to janitor. So whereas a list is just a list of A, B, C, a hash gives you a kind of a 2-dimensional list, as it were. And this just gives you an example of how to put one of them together and then how to query it. Here's a slightly more complex example, which is where we have a list that contains 3 hashes. So it's basically like a list of people, and within that list of people we have individual hashes for each person where it defines that person's name and their age. And then there is further code at the bottom that demonstrates how you access that stuff. So next we're going to look at iterators. These can sometimes confuse people who are new to the language. Here we have yet another way of defining a list. The list on the first line here is basically a list of the names: Fred, Bart, Laura, Gus and Waldo. And the special formatting here, which you don't need to learn at this point, basically just turns each of those words into a list item. So it's not just a string, it is actually a list with 5 different items in. And then what we do is we call the each method upon that list, and we kind of have this weird little block of code that are in the curly braces here that basically takes each element of that list and prints it to the screen. So we end up with each name being printed on a separate line. You can also avoid using curly braces for these kind of code blocks and use a do and an end. And this is the more typical style if you want to go over multiple lines. Here's another type of iterator, and we're working with numbers this time. So you can actually call methods upon numbers in Ruby. So I've taken the number 1, I've asked the number 1 method called up to count up to the number 8, and then run this code block for each instance of that. So it will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like so, and print that to the screen. It can obviously get a lot more complicated than that. So for example, here we have a list of all the numbers 1 through 5, and map is a method that takes one of these code blocks and runs it, does whatever's in the code block for each of the elements, but then returns the list as if that operation has been performed upon each of the elements. So our code block simply has number times 2, and it returns the list where each element has been multiplied by 2. And a slightly more complicated example here where we take each of the numbers, we convert the number to a string. So instead of just being the number 5, it's a textual string that has the number 5 in it, and we multiply that by 2. Now what happens if you take a string and you multiply it by 2? You don't multiply the number, you multiply the fact of the whatever's in the string. So if you've got the number 5 in the string and you multiply it by 2, you end up with 5, 5, because we're looking at it from a character point of view now rather than as a number. And so you can see what the result is here for each of those elements. Now, this is really if you're already familiar with object-oriented programming. If not, you just want to kind of let this go over your head a bit. But you can define classes in Ruby very easily just using the class keyword, the name of the class, whatever you want to call it, an end. And then you can create new instances very simply with the new method upon that class. There's some kind of candy in the language for adding accessors very easily if you're familiar with JavaScript. Or even, not JavaScript, Java and languages like that. You'll see how simple this is. We can literally just say, create an accessor for the name property or the age property, and it does all the work behind the scenes. So here's a slightly different example where we've created our own accessors, and we've used special instance variables within the class, which are these variables that begin with the @ symbols to store information within the class. And this is where we've gone back again and we're using some of that clever Ruby candy to create a special type of accessor that's just a reader rather than a reader and a setter. And again, if none of this makes any sense to you, that's fine. Just let this gloss over you. It's just a slightly more technical examination for people who are familiar with these concepts. So we're going to stop with the language here. But just before we go, I'm going to give you a very cute example of just a very small but complete app that creates a very interesting graphic. So here's our code. The code at the top loads in a library to produce a PNG file, which is a type of graphic file. This next part does some very interesting mathematics. It's basically a method that takes an X and a Y coordinate and then does some funky mathematics on them. Next, we create a 500 by 500 pixel PNG canvas, and then we iterate through the numbers 0 through 499 in 2 dimensions to get the Y and the X. So we go through every single pixel of that canvas, and we set the color to black or white depending on the results of that mathematical operation earlier. And then last but not least, we take the canvas and we write it out to a file called pattern.png, which if we run this app and then we look at the picture, it looks like that. Crazy stuff, yeah? So if you want to learn more about the language side of things, go and check out the Ruby language homepage at ruby-lang.org. So now we're going to move on to community. And the community, I think, is what really defines what Ruby is all about. Every programming language has a community around it in some way or another, but I think this is a big deal for Ruby. And in terms of general purpose language with a sizable community, I think Ruby has one of the richest. It's not without its spats, its biases, its egos, people yelling at each other and so on, but at least it's quite present and easily visible. This isn't true of some languages where it's really hard to dig out who's involved. So some community things. Let's start at something that perhaps a lot of people have been to, an event. And there are tons. There's things like RailsConf. There was the Ruby Falls that I originally prepared this presentation for. There's the annual Euruco, European Ruby conferences that move around. I think it was Prague, Barcelona, Poland. I think it's going to be Berlin in 2011 and so on. And there's also sort of the home Ruby conference in Japan called Ruby Kaigi as well. There's also a lot of user groups for Ruby, and they're all over the world, places like San Diego, Portland, Copenhagen, in the UK. The one that I attend is called Leeds Ruby Thing, which is in Leeds, which is in north of England. There's also a lot of books in the community, and they're both free and paid, self-published and through major publishers. And perhaps the most famous Ruby book is Programming Ruby by Dave Thomas, and it also has Chad Fowler and Andy Hunt contributing in there as well. And this was, I think, it was the first English language book. There were Japanese Ruby books before, but they brought this out in the year 2000, and apparently it's a very niche language, and I guess they didn't have any idea how well this book was going to do back then, because no one was really into Ruby at that point. And effectively, this book did bring Ruby to the West, and it's been updated several times since then. And this is Dave Thomas, the guy who is the main author for that book. And again, if you see him, buy him a drink or shake his hand. There's lots of other books. There's The Ruby Way by Hal Fulton is a really good book that digs into like the structure of Ruby and working with classes and metaprogramming and stuff like that. And as you can see, there's just tons. I'm a big fan of the Ruby programming language O'Reilly book by David Flanagan and Matt himself. I think it's just the best reference to the core language. And there's some other stuff. And of course, there's my book Beginning Ruby as well, which I am obliged to mention. So there's lots of other stuff as well. There are blogs, there's screencasts, and they're basically videos, a bit like this really, but they go into sort of code and so on. There's chat rooms and stuff like that. And this is Ruby Inside, which is my Ruby programming news blog. That's been going for, I think, just coming up to 5 years now. There's sites that sort of collate together all of the different Ruby-related posts from here and there. Peepcode.com is a site where a guy called Jeffrey Grossenbach, he basically self-publishes videos that are about Rails, or initially it was all about Rails and Ruby, but now he's extended out to other topics, including JavaScript and source code editors and stuff like that. But he has some great stuff on there. There's also people doing the same kind of thing for free. A guy called Ryan Bates has been doing these, what are called Rails casts, for years. He's up to episode 247 as of early 2011. You can subscribe to that as a podcast, or you can just view them in your browser. He covers not just Rails topics, but some Ruby topics as well. And I guess through this, you've kind of seen that perhaps the people were really important in the Ruby world as well. I've shown you Matt's and Dave Thomas, and they've clearly had a big influence. But there's other people as well. You could just name drop all day people that are well known in the Ruby scene and who sort of make it a richer and more enjoyable place, and who really make Ruby what it is. So as much as the people in the communities make the programming language what it is at the human level, libraries make a language kind of what it is at a wider technical level. When I started with Ruby several years ago, there were barely any libraries to do anything. They were often poorly documented, hard to install, a lot of work to be done. And that work did get done. Now there's thousands of published Ruby libraries, they're easy to install, and people are coming out with new things all the time. And one of the biggest reasons for this boom is that the creation of a good package management system for Ruby libraries, and it's called Ruby Gems. And Ruby Gems is basically a package management system for Ruby libraries and applications in some cases. And you can host these kind of packages wherever you like, but rubygems.org is the primary central repository now, where almost everyone releases their own gems nowadays. And if you want to install something like Rails, for example, from the command line you can just run gem install Rails, and it will install Rails, and it will install other gems that Rails depends upon as well. And if you're familiar with Linux or ports on various BSDs, you'll kind of have an idea what's going on here. So just as an example of how to use a gem, and this is a Ruby 1.8 example, all you have to do is load in the Ruby Gems library with the require line at the top, and then you can require in, say, Chronic. Let's say I've done gem install Chronic. Chronic is a library that lets you pass times into a more internal kind of date-time structure, so I can say chronic.pass next Monday at 5 PM and it has the info in there, and it says 2008 because I'm still using the slides from my very old Ruby Falls presentation, but Chronic is still going and still being updated, so I still recommend that. Is a library called Gruff, which is by the Jeffrey Grossenbach, the peepcode guy I mentioned previously, and this lets you take sort of Ruby data structures like your arrays and hashes and so on and turn them into wonderful graphs like this. There's also the classifier library that lets you kind of build up a training system for different types of content, so you can see whether something is spam or whether it's not spam or whatever. Lots of stuff you can do, and this is just a list of some of the other things that there are in Ruby. You know, there's servers, there's email generation, there's database access, there's web crawling, tons and tons of stuff, just too much stuff to mention. So some applications. Most of these are quite old, just because I've kept them from the old presentation, but I believe they all still exist. The first type of app is the good old command line application. This is where you sort of take some parameters in, do some stuff, print things back out to standard out or to the prompt. This is a really common thing to do from Ruby, and it's also where other languages like Perl and Python have a big influence as well. And this is a little app called Rack, and it's what they call an intelligent replacement for grep. It can handle Ruby syntax and so on, and doesn't dig through your SVN directories and so on. And just mentioning SVN kind of dates this presentation somewhat. Here's an email app called Sup, and yeah, this is a really cool bit of work. Basically, command line, pure text, email, client, all written in Ruby. There used to be an IDE written in Ruby. There are things that have come along to kind of supersede this now, and there's no active development on FreeRide anymore. But FreeRide was actually a text editor written in Ruby. GitNub is an interesting one. It's actually a Mac app, but it's written in Ruby. Lets you look at some of the stuff that's on GitHub. There's games, all this kind of stuff that you can build, and the code isn't particularly complex for that, and it's a 3D game, and so on and so forth. Last but not least, we have the actual implementations that run these Ruby scripts. So we've focused on Ruby as a language in terms of the official implementation so far, and this is known as MRI, which stands for Matz's Ruby implementation. It comes in a few different varieties, and the key ones you may have picked up from this video, 1.8 and 1.9, and in their most recent incarnations they're 1.8.7 and 1.9.2. But there are others as well. I've just listed sort of the main ones here, but there are more. JRuby actually came out very early. It was initially conceived in 2001, but it went through some sort of reorganizations, and eventually there was a core team of 4 members, and 2 of them ended up getting hired by Sun, who were the creators of Java at the time, before it was purchased by Oracle, and now they've been hired by Engine Yard. And JRuby is perhaps I think a lot of people would consider it to be the second best Ruby implementation at the moment. Of course, the JRuby team themselves think it is the best one, and they're totally entitled to think that. And actually, in some situations, it is the best. If you want to deploy into a Java ecosystem or on the JVM for whatever reason, obviously that's the way to go. And in terms of performance, it often gives Ruby 1.9 a run for its money, but not all the time. I think it's kind of half and half there at the moment, so we'll see how that goes. But they're definitely, I think, the most proactive alternative implementation of Ruby. Iron Ruby was a Microsoft project, but it's been kind of released to the community now. They've kind of lost a little bit of interest in it, but it's still under active development. That had a 1.0 release in 2010. And Rubinius is kind of like a Ruby that's partially written in Ruby itself. Too much to go into here, but if you go to rubini.us, that's rubini.us, for more info, that's now considered a mainstream Ruby implementation, where it perhaps wasn't back in 2008, and it will actually run most code fine now. And there are more. Maglev is an important one. Mac Ruby is particularly important because Apple are working on that, and it's a good way into developing full-blown Mac apps with Ruby, so that's worth looking at as well. So we've talked about a lot of things, and when people are talking about things in other videos, or the course you're on, or the book you're reading, or whatever, hopefully this video is just giving you a little bit more of an idea to the background of Ruby, its community, and so you have more of a feel for what the language is and what it can do, and so on and so forth, and perhaps have some ideas of perhaps where to look next to learn a bit more. So that's all for now, and thank you very much.